After World War I, liquor sales were up and alcoholism rates were climbing. Many activists like Carrie Nation and activist groups like the American Temperance Union were pushing the ban of alcohol on moral grounds. Prohibition had legal roots in Minnesota. Minnesota's own representative, Andrew Volstead, was the sponsor to the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, also known as the National Prohibition Act. Prohibition was approved by Congress in 1919 and made into law in 1920. What lawmakers and activists didn't realize was the consequences prohibition would bring, such as rise in bootlegging, gambling, and organized crime by gangsters. In one 5-month period in the 1920s, prohibition agents confiscated over 290 gallons of moonshine, more than 50 automobiles, destroyed 315 whiskey stills, and arrested 1,275 people. Ultimately, prohibition failed because enforcement of it was impossible, especially when that task was left to corrupt local law enforcement. So how did Minnesota play a role in prohibition and organized crime? Minnesota was a safe haven for gangsters thanks to St. Paul Police Chief John O'Connor. O'Connor was an intimidating force. He believed it was his responsibility to protect the citizens of St. Paul. The real danger was that he believed he could do this by creating his own set of rules. This is how the O'Connor system, or the layover agreement, was born. O'Connor invited crooks to St. Paul, promising them police protection. The process went like this. Criminals had to check in with the police upon their arrival in St. Paul. This check-in involved the payment of a bribe to ensure protection. These bribes were everything from whiskey to $10,000 cash payments. As long as they refrained from violent crime in St. Paul's borders, police ignored their activities and even protected them from other states and cities after them for their crimes. Take the case of Bert Stevens, a small-time hijacker who saw the chance to break into the Syndicate, the largest bootlegging network in St. Paul. The Syndicate operated thanks to the bribes it paid to St. Paul police. It made $20,000 per week and paid a good chunk of that to the police. Stevens lied to the Syndicate that prohibition agents were onto them. When they wouldn't pay him for the tip, he attempted to hijack their supply. The Syndicate shot him down. While 2 of its members were convicted, the Syndicate fell apart. Its leader, Leon Glickman, was left untouched thanks to his ties to the St. Paul police. He profited from this special treatment by keeping the Syndicate's bootlegging contacts. O'Connor may have had good intentions, and his system did limit violent crime, but without thinking, O'Connor had turned St. Paul into the training grounds and headquarters for the country's most dangerous criminals. Alvin Karpis, FBI public enemy number 1, was quoted after New Year's Eve celebration in 1932. There was probably never before a complete gathering of criminals in one room in the United States as there was that night in the Green Lantern. I was dazzled. The Green Lantern was the St. Paul hangout. The U.S. Attorney General called St. Paul, and I quote, "a poison spot of the nation, a haven for criminals." Chief O'Connor barely kept control of the city. Soon O'Connor and police had to turn to gangsters like the notorious Dapper Dan Hogan to stay informed and keep peace. Violent crime was not a problem, but gambling and prostitution rose. O'Connor's retirement in 1920, combined with the death of Dapper Dan Hogan at the hands of his mob boss in a car bombing at 1607 West 7th Street in 1924, signaled an end to the O'Connor system. The police chiefs that followed O'Connor did not have his power, and they were not successful in keeping order. Prohibition was repealed in 1933, but that did not mean an end to the trouble for St. Paul. Gangster activity was strong, law enforcement was weak, and with alcohol legal, crime came out of the underground and violence began. In 1933, the Barker Karpis gang kidnapped businessman William Ham Jr. for a ransom of $100,000, and just 6 months later, they kidnapped banker Edward Bremier for a $200,000 ransom. On a side note, the kidnapping of William Ham was practiced at the infamous Hollyhocks Club, a mansion located at 1590 River Road, that operated as the premier speakeasy, steakhouse, and casino during Prohibition. It would not be uncommon to see police and gangsters together at Hollyhocks. One of the gangsters' biggest friends on the St. Paul police force was Detective Thomas Brown, who was known to take bribes and extended courtesies to gangsters. He was thought to take the biggest portion of the ransom of the William Ham kidnapping, taking home $25,000, more than any of the gangsters involved in the plot. On March 31st, two major things happened. Dillinger shot his way out of the Lincoln Court Apartments at 93 Lexington Avenue, and while the Dillinger shootout was happening, the grand jury was ruling that St. Paul's gangster activity needed federal help. Political cartoons of the time show public opinion. One of these showed police and gangster corruption as if it were played like a board game. Another cartoon showed St. Paul police welcoming a gangster to town through a sewer. The St. Paul Daily News used monkeys to show how the mayor and grand jury hear, see, and do nothing during this time. Ultimately, St. Paul learned a valuable lesson. Police department was forced to use merit for choosing its chief rather than political motivations of the mayor and city council. The grand jury decision and the corruption of the St. Paul police paved way for the FBI involvement. This wasn't working in St. Paul. In 1935, there were 5 major gangster murders, 3 large bank robberies, and 2 national kidnappings. The Bureau named new chief, J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was furious about the state of crime and rule of gangsters. The Bureau didn't have the power to take down gunmen. Their main role was to investigate the criminals' tax records. Hoover set out to redefine the FBI in 3 ways. Get rid of political corruption, start a code of conduct, and provide formal training for agents. Around this time, the FBI turned to technology, starting a fingerprinting lab, forming a central database for criminal statistics and records, and using wiretapping. 90% of evidence gathered from wiretapping during the early 1930s led to the capture of criminals. November 24, 1932, is the official birthday of the FBI laboratory, and it marks the start of the modern FBI. Congress saw that the Bureau was going to be important in helping local police, like those in St. Paul, bring down criminals. They gave the FBI new powers, including the right to carry guns and make arrests. They also renamed the Bureau of Investigation to be the Federal Bureau of Investigation to show that a new time of law enforcement was beginning. St. Paul and its O'Connor system forever changed the way our country solves crimes and catches criminals. When an event or time period changes how we have traditionally done things, it is a turning point. Of course, the amendment enacting Prohibition and its repeal were important events and taught us lessons about the burden our law enforcement has in upholding the Constitution. The true turning point for the country and the city of St. Paul is how restoring order required a major change to local and federal law enforcement. For St. Paul, it meant new selection process for police chiefs, and for the nation, it meant new, modern FBI with the power, resources, and training they need to enforce laws, gather criminal data, and keep our citizens safe.